Modern Mexico City is one of the largest cities in the world. Once, it was a wilderness area, a valley of saltwater lakes and swamps surrounded by mountains and active volcanoes. At the beginning of the 14th century, a nomadic tribe called the Mexica settled here, giving their name to Mexico and its capital city. Today, the Mexica are better known as the Aztecs. The Aztecs transformed themselves from simple nomads into rulers of the most powerful empire Central America had ever known. But after just 200 years, it would all be gone. Eyewitness accounts of Aztec life and intricate illustrated records portray a highly sophisticated and literate society. Yet, there was a dark side to Aztec life. People lived in fear. Ritual human sacrifice was performed on a scale unmatched throughout history. It's for this, above all things, that the Aztecs are remembered. How could brutal sacrifice be so commonplace in such a civilized society? Who were the Aztecs really? Bloodthirsty barbarians? Or a great world civilization? When the Spanish conquistadors first saw the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, it was so beautiful they thought they were dreaming. They called it the Venice of the Americas. At the height of the Aztec Empire in 1519, the Spaniards had landed on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Having heard about the fabulous riches of the Aztecs, they'd come to make their fortunes. After 12 weeks of marching, they found the Aztec capital. It was built entirely on water, and with over 200,000 inhabitants, was one of the largest cities in all the world. Mexico City was built on the site of Tenochtitlan, an area on the outskirts of today's capital still gives a flavor of what it might have been like. This region still supplies the city with flowers, just as it did 500 years ago for the rituals in the Aztec capital. It was these rituals which so shocked the Spaniards.
We saw the men being dragged up the steps to be sacrificed. The priests laid them down on their backs, and cutting open their chests, drew out their palpitating hearts, which they offered to the idols before them. Then, they flung the bodies down the steps.
Interpreting the cultures of Mexico's past has been a lifetime study for novelist Carlos Fuentes.
The whole conception of the world of the Aztecs is so alien to our modern sense of the world that we can only guess, we can only hint. The Aztec regime, to put it in a nutshell, was a regime at odds with itself.
How could the Aztecs create a beautiful city with such violence at its heart? To investigate the contradiction, it's necessary to go back to the time when the Aztecs first arrived in the Valley of Mexico. The original nomadic tribe of Native Americans lived in the north of what is now Mexico. A tribal prophecy told them to journey south and build a city where they saw an eagle landing on a cactus. According to their history, it was here in this inhospitable swampland that the prophecy came true. At the edge of the valley, 30 miles north, the Aztecs came upon an abandoned place called Teotihuacan. People had first settled in this place 1,000 years before the Aztecs came, but had long since disappeared. The Aztecs discovered a great ghost city. The deserted city seemed tailor-made for the Aztecs and their beliefs. They even adopted as their own the gods that were carved into these ancient temples. The rain god and the feathered serpent god who would eventually bring them to grief. David Carrasco's groundbreaking work explores the profound impact of other cultures on the Aztecs.
The Aztecs of the 15th and 16th century would have been drawn to Teotihuacan because of the monumentality of the place. Teotihuacan is one of the great world cities and the largest ceremonial center in Mesoamerica. The Aztecs, looking for their own origins, their own legitimacy, would have been attracted to this city.
With their humble nomadic background, the Aztecs envied the great architectural heritage and history of their predecessors in the Valley of Mexico. They took many things from this place, including the setting for their creation myth. The Aztec creation story describes how the universe had already passed through 4 eras or stages of the sun. The symbols for each age are depicted on the great Aztec sunstone, 4 feet thick, 12 feet in diameter, and weighing 24 tons. It was discovered in 1790 beneath Mexico City's Central Square. At its center is the face of the sun, with a sacrificial knife in its mouth. Each of the 4 mythical ages lasted hundreds of years and ended in destruction. After the 4th sun, the world was left in darkness. They imagined that the gods gathered here to build a fire and contemplate how they could bring forth another sun. To give the new sun energy to be born and travel on its journey across the sky, the gods sacrificed themselves, jumping into the fire and cutting out their hearts, their own blood giving life to the 5th sun. The dawning of the Aztec Age.
In this remarkable story, we see not only the idea of Teotihuacan as the primordial origin of the Aztec sun, we also see the participation of the gods in a self-sacrifice so that human life can then go on. This sets up for the Aztecs the crucial idea about human sacrifice, which was that when they sacrificed themselves, they were paying a debt back to the gods who had created the sun for them here in Teotihuacan.
The Aztecs believed that the daily journey of the sun could only continue while it was supported with blood. Human sacrifice on the American continent is most often associated with the Aztecs, but in fact, it had been practiced for centuries by previous civilizations, including the builders of Teotihuacan, the Maya, and the Toltecs.
And all peoples that are very close to the origins have an enormous fear that the world will end. That once the sun sets, it will never appear again. That the forces of nature are extremely powerful and have to be pacified. And one of the ways of pacifying them traditionally in all peoples is through sacrifice.
In the hostile environment of the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs felt at the mercy of the powerful forces of nature. 500 years ago, the mountains and volcanoes surrounding the valley were clearly visible from the Aztec capital. Rare today given Mexico City's smog. Here, 30 miles outside the city, there's a clearer view of what the Aztecs would have seen. The landscape holds vital clues to understanding how the Aztecs believed they could influence the gods. Art historian Dick Townsend was the first to map this area. Aztec shrines like this one marked sacred locations, the miniature pyramid steps echoing temple architecture. These were traditionally places to remember the gods of the natural world, to appease and support them by making offerings of flowers, food, drink, or blood.
Offerings would be made in these receptacles and it would run down over the face. This boulder was formerly stood upright and formed part of that whole ensemble. And then the ensemble itself really looks towards the great rain-producing mountains of the Valley of Mexico, Mount Tlaloc, and then more distantly, Ixtlacihuatl and Popocatépetl. It's a replication here in stone what you see out in the natural setting. So in effect, this grouping of rocks forms a kind of miniature world.
To pacify the forces of nature, the Aztecs turned not just to the gods, but to their own sophisticated technology. They had seen the eagle land on a saltwater lake 32 miles long. To build a city here and sustain its people would require a radical transformation of the landscape. This was their first major challenge. They were able to dam and drain some of the salt water and channel fresh water in its place. They transformed the swampland on the outskirts of the city, building islands known as chinampas, or floating gardens. Nowadays, there's a dwindling number of farmers here, but they still use traditional methods which have hardly changed since the Aztec times. Dredging mud from the bottom of the lake, the farmers build up layers of rich, fertile soil and plant willow trees with roots to stabilize the garden platform. 500 years ago, these plots of land were the breadbasket of the Aztec capital, supplying its inhabitants with much of their food. If the rainy season was late, the crops would fail. To make sure this didn't happen, the Aztecs turned to their gods. They believed that they could influence the gods gods by creating idealized replicas of the natural world. It was this belief that inspired all their temples, from the smallest shrine in the countryside to the largest pyramids in the capital. But it's not just a shared inspiration which connects this shrine with the city. It was carefully positioned to form a continuous line of sacred sites joining the rain-producing mountains to the heart of the Aztec capital. The Aztecs believed that this connection would ensure that the seasons stayed in balance. The rain fell, and their city and empire flourished.
Great mountains, the miniature rock mountains, then the hill of Tezcatzingo, and then ultimately the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. They all form part of a symbolic continuum that take the thoughts and the prayers of the city dwellers out to the remote parts of their world.
As precious as jade is how the Aztecs describe their capital, Tenochtitlan. The Great Pyramid, or the Templo Mayor as it's known, honored the two most significant gods for the Aztecs. Tlaloc, the god of rain and water, and Huitzilopochtli, the warrior god associated with the sun. The bodies of sacrificial victims were flung down onto this stone, 11 feet in diameter, which depicts the moon goddess cut into pieces by the warrior god of the sun. It was discovered in 1978 by electrical workers laying cables. This led to the excavations that uncovered the Great Pyramid. Archaeologists have uncovered several layers of construction, all from the 200 years of Aztec rule, which started at the beginning of the 14th century. The pyramid was rebuilt 7 times and modified at least 5. Each new level rose above and sealed off the previous one. They were building upon success. Despite their choice of a place to settle, the Aztecs flourished. Crowds of between 25 and 60,000 people gathered daily at Tlatelolco, site of the biggest market supplying the Aztec metropolis. Here, you could buy anything from cactus to live animals. We share many of the foods which flourished in Aztec times: avocados, squash, beans, chilies, and corn, ground into flour to make tortillas, as important a diet staple then as they are today. All this abundance was the product of their own ingenuity, but the Aztecs gave credit to their gods and made offerings accordingly. Hoping to uncover more about the offerings, in 1990, scientists began to analyze soil samples from the Great Pyramid. Analysis is still in progress, but some extraordinary results are beginning to emerge. Over 50 different varieties of plants have been identified. Flowers and seeds were a vital ingredient of offerings which the Aztecs buried in the foundations of the Great Pyramid. So far, over 135 different offering groups have been uncovered. These offerings represented a miniature version of the entire universe in harmony. The levels of existence, the overworld, the earth, and the underworld were represented by different plants, animals, and artifacts. The fire god gave energy and life to the universe. Alongside him is a vase depicting Tlaloc, the god of rain and water, tilted on its side to encourage rain. Jade beads represent water drops. Tlaloc is recognizable by his goggle eyes, fangs, and serpent nose. There are still serpents to be found among the ruins of the Great Pyramid.
In the Egyptian world, the pyramids were largely used as interior spaces for burials, but in Mesoamerica, the pyramids and the ceremonial centers were exterior spaces. They were theaters. Theaters for the performance of the relationship between the people and the gods, between nature and daily life.
In these theaters, the Aztec gods and goddesses were represented by sculptures. This enormous figure, over 8 feet tall and weighing 12 tons, is the earth goddess Coatlicue.
This is a block, a solid block which cannot be penetrated. It doesn't even have a sex. It is a massive sculpture with no penetration whatsoever. I think it was Baudelaire who, when he saw reproductions of Aztec sculpture in Paris in the 19th century, said this is a barbaric art. Barbaric in the sense that it is completely alien to the human. There is very little humanity in most of Aztec sculpture. It is a brutal assertion of the powers of the gods and of the goddesses. They are different from you and me. They are different from women and men. Do not forget it.
This sculpture reveals the bloodshed that inevitably accompanied Aztec mythology. The goddess is portrayed as a decapitated figure. 2 great serpents representing streams of blood flow from her neck. For archaeologist Elizabeth Baquedano, a leading expert on Aztec sculpture, these images are keys to their way of life and death.
Blood, of course, is the essence of our body, is what makes us alive. And of course, there's nothing more precious in ourselves than our blood. Blood was given to the gods in order for them to survive.
But how did they use blood in their rituals? A few yards from the ruins of the Great Pyramid lies one of the only covered spaces in this vast sacred complex. Only a building of real importance could have been sited so close to the heart of this precinct. The reason for its privileged position began to emerge once excavations were carried out. 3 distinct sections were uncovered, progressing in sacred significance. A portico opened into an outer hall where 2 sculpted warriors stood. Eagle warriors. Archaeologists believe that this was the temple of the Eagle warriors. They wore beautiful eagle costumes and were loved and rewarded by the rulers, just like the knights of a royal court. The inner sanctum could only be entered by passing 2 terrifying figures. This is the god of death, Mictlantecuhtli. His protruding liver, an image of regeneration. rulers guarded the most sacred area of the temple, a four-sided patio decorated with four-petaled flowers. In order to investigate the rituals that took place here, scientists are collaborating with archaeologists. Chemical analysis of samples from the plaster floor indicates the presence of a variety of substances. As a purification ceremony, frankincense or copal may have been burnt in these huge braziers depicting Tlaloc, the rain god. Most telling of all, the scientists found traces of albumin, indicating the presence of blood, where these benches are decorated with clusters of flowers. The painting marks the spot where real clusters of flowers once stood. They contain the spines of the maguey cactus and sharpened animal bones, which the eagle warriors used to pierce the earlobe, thigh, arm, tongue, or penis, offering their own blood to the gods. This ritual bloodletting, auto-sacrifice as it's called, was the most common form of Aztec sacrifice. In this relief, warriors proceed towards the cluster of flowers to perform this ceremony. Perhaps the Aztec rulers themselves came here to shed their own blood? After extensive analysis of their results, scientists have discovered the highest concentration of albumin around the gods of death. Their results confirm the accuracy of the Aztec records depicting large quantities of blood poured over these gods. Archaeologists believe that this ceremony marked the death of one ruler and the inauguration of the next. A reminder of the continuous cycle of life and death in the natural world. And the rituals seem to work. Within just 140 years of their arrival in the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs conquered land stretching from the Gulf of Mexico in the east to the Pacific coast in the west, more than 300 miles away. By the time the Spaniards arrived, 60 years later, the empire stretched as far south as the borders of Guatemala. The Aztecs demanded tribute from each conquered state. In time, they would pay dearly for this coercion. Jade, turquoise, obsidian, and alabaster for the ritual offerings buried at the Great Pyramid. Aztec society was itself a pyramid with a strict hierarchy. At its top, the ruler himself, combining spiritual, political, and military powers. In this frieze, the ruler is depicted triumphantly grasping the forelocks of conquered leaders. The stone itself served a much bloodier purpose. Victims were tethered to the center and provided only with dummy weapons. Warriors fought them to the death. Both Aztecs and their enemies were sacrificed. For the Aztecs, it was an honor. But sacrifice was a powerful tool for intimidating enemies. Rulers were expected to prove their worth by capturing live victims for sacrifice to the sun god.
And their blood then ritually makes the land fruitful. It fertilizes the land, so that in that way the blood of the slain will contribute towards the rebirth of vegetation in the rainy season and the flowers that go all with that. So that blood and flowers is a way of referring to this great cycle of life and the rhythm of human activities that unfolds within the changing seasons.
Looking at these bloody rituals from a present-day perspective, it's difficult to understand the people who performed them, and easy to condemn them as a brutal, alien race. Perhaps in the context of their age, the Aztecs have been judged harshly. Ross Hassig has scrutinized the historical records.
But at the same time they were sacrificing people, of course we have the Inquisition going on in Spain, which people are being killed for heresy. We have criminals and political enemies having their heads placed on stakes on the Tower of London. And so there's plenty of barbarity at this time to go around for almost all people. It's easier for people to see another group as being strange and different and look how quaint, look how bizarre, look how weird they are, rather than go through the actual difficult research of trying to make them explicable, trying to make them human and understandable in our own terms.
Making the Aztecs human and understandable is the challenge for David Carrasco.
Many of our descriptions of ancient societies are so simple, but in fact the Aztecs show us that human beings are complex. To take the simple notion that they're bloody people and to show that they're both people after the blood and after the flower is to bring us to a wonderful image of understanding and asking about the nature of complexity.
Aside from the violence, it seems, there was a much gentler side to Aztec life. An extraordinary love of beauty emerges in the most popular of their arts, poetry. Poets were loved and highly revered. One of the most famous was also a great architect of the empire.
It's not true that we come to this earth to live. We come only to sleep, only to dream.
It's an extremely beautiful poetry which essentially sings about the fleetingness of life, the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, the price we must pay to be on earth, the beauty of the things that surround us, flowers, love, women, children. All these things are celebrated by the Aztecs and speak of a humane spirit which I think is not only similar but superior to ours.
Our body is a flower. As grass becomes green in the springtime, so our hearts will open and blossom, and then they will die.
The god of poetry was also the god of flowers, music, and joy. But while he's depicted covered in flowers, he also wears the flayed skin of a sacrificial victim. Life and death went hand in hand for the Aztecs. The blood rituals seemed to appease the gods and sustain the Aztecs' expanding empire. But then the rhythm of the seasons broke down. Drought struck the Valley of Mexico in 1450, lasting for 4 years. Aztec records show diseased and starving people. Thousands died. Perhaps the gods needed more. Among the remains of Tlatelolco, site of the Great Market and the second biggest pyramid complex, archaeologists made a horrifying discovery. It dated from the desperate years of drought. On the threshold of a temple, they found the bone remains of around 40 children. The bones were grouped together with precious ritual objects, an offering to the gods. Children's bones from the same period have also been found at the Great Pyramid. It wasn't unusual for the Aztecs to sacrifice young children, but these numbers are exceptional. The victims are thought to have been between 2 and 6 years of age. Scientists are currently analyzing the remains to find out why these children were chosen. By extracting and testing samples of their DNA, the scientists will discover their sex and more about their health. When the terrible years of drought finally ended, the Aztecs built a series of new temples, giving thanks to the gods, so that it would never happen again. On the hill of Tezcotzingo, on the line which joined the mountains with the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, the poet-ruler of the time designed a ritual center dedicated to the god of rain and his consort, the water goddess. Historians had known about this place from the Aztec records, but it was Dick Townsend who first uncovered its significance.
I simply had a kind of premonition that this amazing sort of conical hill was going to be very, very important. And sure enough, upon coming up the trail and seeing that great tank of water and realizing that streams of water were flowing in here, I thought, this is a sacred mountain.
Sculpting the landscape, the Aztecs created a beautiful ideal model intended to bring rain to the real world. Water channeled from the mountains through an aqueduct flowed around the hill, filling baths and basins at shrines along the way. Walkways followed the channels, paths for ritual processions by priests and rulers. This paradise garden of flowing water is an extraordinary testimony to the skills and beliefs of its architects. Above this shrine, a temple celebrates the poet-ruler who conceived this place. Higher still, a temple honors the rain god. Corn or maize goddesses were cut into the rock to ensure the fertility of the land. The terraces below were once covered with plants and trees, some brought from the farthest ends of the empire. The Aztecs had a remarkable knowledge of horticulture, experimenting in these gardens with species new to the Valley of Mexico. They were also renowned herbalists and healers. But all their healing wisdom and all their offerings to the gods would be powerless against the disaster which was to come. Over a year before the Spaniards arrived in 1519, according to Aztec records, a series of omens warned of impending catastrophe. The temple of the warrior god of the sun suddenly burst into flames. Comets and lightning followed, and the ruler of the time, Moctezuma, had a vision. People coming as conquerors and riding on deer.
Marco Polo had been to China. Vasco da Gama had discovered the route through the Cape. The continent was in ferment, in movement, whereas the Mexican world was extremely closed in. It was absolutely hermetically closed. So that the arrival of the Spaniards must have been like the arrival of people from Mars to us would be today. Totally unsuspected aliens. Totally unsuspected aliens. The shock must have been profound. I think it's one of the reasons that explains the downfall of the Aztec Empire. In a sense, I think the Aztec Empire died of astonishment more than of anything else.
By extraordinary coincidence, the 500 conquistadors led by Hernan Cortez arrived during the exact year when an Aztec prophecy foretold the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god.
Feathered serpents represent not only the precious powers of the earth, but also the flowers of the earth. The ability of the earth to be reborn in a kind of optimistic cycle that was very important to Aztec life. The symbol of Quetzalcoatl also, he was a myth of eternal return, that he would return periodically in the form of a ruler, in the form of a great priest or a great man. He's a symbol who's there in the beginning of history, at the center of history as a great creator God, and then at the end of their history as someone who returns at first to save them, but then in the face of Spanish arms and disease is not able to allow Aztec life to go on.
The prophecy suggested that the returning Quetzalcoatl would be fair-skinned and bring peace and justice. Could this be why the Spanish soldiers were welcomed so warmly? Their leader, Hernan Cortez, described his impressions in letters to Charles V, King of Spain.
I cannot describe 1/100th part of all the things which could be mentioned. I will say only that these people live almost like those in Spain, and in as much harmony and order as there. And considering that they're barbarous and so far from the knowledge of God and cut off from all civilized nations, it is truly remarkable to see what they have achieved in all things.
But there was another reason why the arrival of the Spaniards was so fortuitous. Over the previous 3 decades, Aztec demands for tribute had sparked growing unrest among the tribes they had conquered. The incidence of sacrifice increased dramatically. The worst occasion in 1487 when, records claim, 80,000 people were killed. A bloody example to deter further unrest. The Spaniards had come not just to conquer lands for their king, but to make money for themselves. Joining forces with the Aztecs' tribal enemies gave Hernan Cortez the opportunity he was looking for.
So when the whole conquest was carried out, Cortez takes credit for it. Cortez is constantly talking about what he and his men are doing, but we're still talking about a few hundreds of Spaniards backed up by hundreds of thousands of Indian allies. So the conquest of the Aztecs is not a Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and their empire, but an Indian conquest.
With crossbows and guns, the Spaniards were able to open up the Aztec lines, enabling their Indian allies to carry on the battle with their traditional weapons. But where the Aztecs fought to take live captives for sacrifice, these enemies shot to kill.
The Aztec nation as such disappeared with the conquest. There are a number of poems and chants associated with the downfall of the Aztec world, and one of them says, "Cry, oh cry, for we have lost the Aztec nation."
Throughout the Aztec Empire, the Spanish settlers destroyed pyramids and temples, using the stones to build their own churches. On the site of the Great Pyramid Complex, the Spaniards built a cathedral, which became the center of their capital, today's Mexico City. In the new empire, Spanish became the dominant language. The Spaniards forced the Indians to work for them, and many were treated with great cruelty.
People often condemned the Aztecs, but when you look at what happened when the Spaniards came, their society has been called a mass sacrifice society or a massacre society because within 100 years, 90% of the indigenous population in Mexico and in the New World was gone.
The worst killer of all was disease. The settlers brought smallpox, typhus, and other diseases new to the American continent, to which the native population had no resistance.
And the fact remains today that, well, only about 10% of the population is pure Indian cultures. That they have managed to survive over nearly 5 centuries is a miracle in itself. That the brutality of the modern Republican regimes throughout Latin America towards the Indian population has been more brutal, more destructive than even that of the original Spanish conquistadors.
But within just 2 generations, a new world was born out of the death of the Aztec Empire, a mixed or mestizo people.
The mestizo world, which appeared very soon after the conquest in Mexico, the birth of a new race, the descendants of Europeans and Indians, which form the majority of Mexicans today, happened very quickly. It was in stark contrast with the English colonization of what is today the United States of North America.
Less than an hour's drive from Mexico City, a group of villages lies on the edge of the valley. The people here still speak Nahuatl, the ancient language of the Aztecs, and it's a crucial part of their identity as modern Mexicans. Every Saturday, the village school opens for extra classes. Nahuatl speakers come to study the roots of their language and the Aztec historical records. Their children learn both Spanish and Nahuatl, one of the most widely used of the 47 Indian languages still spoken in Mexico. The combined legacy of the Aztecs and the conquistadors is visible not just in the small communities who cherish their Aztec past. It emerges most clearly in the religious practices of the majority of modern Mexicans. Their roots date from the conquest, when the Indians recognized familiar concepts in Catholicism.
The symbol of Christianity was a man who had been sacrificed, Jesus Christ. That instead of demanding sacrifice from them, the God of Christianity sacrificed himself. He was on the cross. This brought thousands of Indians into Christianity. In enormous belief and faith of the God who had dared turn the tables of their whole concept of the world, and instead of demanding sacrifice of the people, said, I sacrifice myself for you.
This extraordinary merging of cultures and beliefs is the foundation of modern Mexico.
We're moving into a world where the cultures are mixing, communicating and transforming each other in remarkably creative ways. And what you have coming out of the Aztec world and its meeting with Europe is one of the primary examples, it seems to me, of what our understanding of the future is going to be.
Mexico still shares many of the Aztecs' problems. A growing urban population, the threat of earthquakes and volcanoes, and a natural world which has lost its balance. Not because of the gods, but because of environmental abuse. And just like the early Aztecs, many Mexicans have become nomads and migrants.
The Aztec world contains many warnings for the modern world. It gives us a profound lesson about the brittleness of any given culture of civilization, and it teaches us to be always on the alert, to understand the other, to await the arrival of the alien, of what is different, of what challenges our own prejudices, our own preconceptions of what the world and life are all about.